Only mode.
Hello, 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 everyone. We have a really fun game design webinar set up for today. We have a couple of special guests here, and I'm just going to click through the PowerPoint and hand it off to him as quickly as possible. So today is welcome, Happy New Year. It's January 2015. I am your lovely and curvaceous host, Chris Wombat Crowell. I design games, have done that for a long time. I've been doing game design for a long time, so enough about me. On to the next one. Mike Breault is our special guest. He's the color commentary. He's like our John Madden here. So he has been making games for even longer than I have, and he's just a fun dude. And our key presenter today is Patrick Holleman. Patrick is an author who studies video games and is also, does game design himself. So I asked him to, we broached on this topic a while ago, and I asked him to come back and talk more about the history of the RPG, because there's just a lot of really fascinating things about how RPGs have influenced the whole video game industry. And so with that, that said, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Patrick, because he is the star today. Let me find the button that makes him the presenter. Ba-boom, ba-boom.
All right,
voila.
show my screen, and I'm going to go into this PowerPoint here. And all right, I can't see what's on screen now. Is this showing up for everybody?
You got it. Slide number one.
All right, so today I'm going to talk about the history of the game design behind RPGs, and specifically how that history sort of inflected and changed when the RPG entered the video game space. Because obviously the RPG started in the tabletop space, and it started with sort of a colossal bang in the tabletop space in the form of Dungeons and Dragons, which was the first, if not the first RPG, it was the RPG, the RPG from which all other RPGs really have stemmed since it came out. And we're going to talk about how the transition from tabletop to video game had a lot of design implications. We're also going to talk about basically how the influence of Dungeons and Dragons has been so incredibly overbearing in good and bad ways in the history of the RPG that designers in the video game space especially had to do some very bizarre things in order to differentiate their work. So the ancient Hebrew peoples had a belief, this is an analogy here, bear with me. The ancient Hebrew peoples had a belief that they could trace through their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, that they could trace their lineage all the way back to the first man in the Garden of Eden, who was Adam. I have no idea whether that was actually possible or not, but as RPG designers, we can trace our lineage back to the Adam, the single man who essentially gave birth to all of this. Although Mike Breault is going to tell us a little bit how he might have stolen a bit more credit than we think. But we can trace our lineage as RPG designers all the way back to Adam, and that's Gary Gygax, the creator of... Please, go ahead.
No, I just want to point out the copious amounts of facial hair that are present in this divine picture. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
A rugged, full, and plush beard, essential component of RPG designers, especially if you started at tabletop. You had to have a beard.
Dave Arneson, too.
Dave Arneson, yeah. So, I mean, I have a history, and if some of what I have been, gleaned from my research is not correct, because Mike Breault worked at TSR during the sort of adolescence and adulthood of Dungeons and Dragons, and he can fill us in on the details that the history books have wrong. But so Gygax stood it, and to sort of give a summation of what Gygax's role is, that many people were instrumental in designing of the RPG, the creation of the RPG. It just happened that Gygax stood at sort of the intersection, the crossroads, where strategy games made a left turn and became RPGs. With him there was obviously Dave Arneson and many other people. But Gygax, he took a lot of the credit, but he also made a few design contributions that were sort of instrumental. The two foundational ideas of the RPG. We're going to get into those right now. So, as I said, the RPG started in the tabletop space, and it didn't come out of nowhere, not by any means. In fact, in the middle of the 20th century, especially the 60s and 70s, there was a really rich board game heritage, strategy games. You can see hex-based games. What typically today is called Eurostrat, although that's sort of a misnomer. But this rich heritage of board games with lots of rules, lots of mechanics, lots of pieces and dice gave birth to the RPG through a couple of steps. And those steps are some of the things that Gygax and his people at TSR, what was then the Lake Geneva Tactical Society, were doing in the early 70s.
Yeah,
So the two ideas, and I want to, Mike, I'll toss it over to you right after I get through these two ideas real quick, okay?
Sure.
The two main ideas, and these are going to come up over and over again in the presentation, which is why I want to get to them right now, is the simulated skill. That's the first thing that they inherited from the strategy games that they were playing. Now, a simulated skill has three characteristics, important characteristics. A simulated skill is performed by a character rather than by a player. So in Mortal Kombat, to give a really contrasting example, the player has to actually perform an action. The player has to hit the right button combination at the right time, at the right distance, in the right stance or whatever, to activate Liu Kang's fireball. But in an RPG, the player simply declares or selects the ability, and that's the way that the ability is activated. If you want to get like your wizard in Dungeons & Dragons needs to cast a fireball, you simply declare, my wizard is casting a fireball. As long as the cooldowns are up, you're going to roll the dice, and that's a fireball. There's no performative aspect for the player. The performative aspect is entirely for the character. And then the other two big important things for the simulated skill is one is based partly on character attributes, like the character sheet you see there in the bottom right. In this case, it would be the intelligence and wisdom stats would be the ones used to calculate the damage and effectiveness of the fireball. And then the other part of that is based on chance. Chance is the biggest thing that was taken from the strategy games. There's a quote in the, I want to say it's first edition of Chainmail, which is the sort of missing link in the chain of how we got from strategy to RPG, where Gygax was talking about, and it could have been somebody else but Gygax, but he took the credit. Gygax was talking about how they had a game with a tactical balance of very much rock, paper, scissors. Horsemen would defeat swordsmen, swordsmen would defeat pikemen, pikemen would defeat horsemen. It's very standard rock, paper, scissors balance that we still have today. But he wanted to introduce an element of chance to it because, I guess, I'm going to misquote it a little bit here, but he said, there's nevertheless a chance that although the horsemen are supposed to be beaten by the pikemen, there's nevertheless a chance that the pike or the horsemen might prevail because of some phenomenal event. And that's what chance simulates in the game. And so those three things, the performative action by the character rather than the player, character attributes, and chance are all descended from strategy games, more or less directly. The second development, and the one that probably really makes RPGs what they are, is the level up. So a level up is a permanent periodic increase in power, or permanent periodic increase in the power of simulated skills. So when I say permanent, I mean that, except in very rare cases, once you gain a level, that level is never going away. Once you reach level 22, the only time you're going to leave level 22 is to go to level 23, which is, you're still retaining level 22, you're just gaining one more. Periodic means that it happens at a regular interval. In the case of most RPGs, that regular interval is determined by experience points. You accrue experience points, and once you hit a certain regular interval, the growth of which is charted by a mathematical formula very easily, you gain the next level. And then character power is, of course, the simulated skills, which I just talked about. So that's what I mean by a permanent periodic increase in power. But it's not just character levels that are gained in an RPG. Obviously, in World of Warcraft, everyone who's played it knows the ding animation that goes off and when that character levels up. But there's also other things that can level up in a game, and they're actually just as important. On the right there, you have Final Fantasy VI, where one of the Magicites, one of the summonable creatures who teaches magic, levels up and teaches a better spell. But also, we don't really think about it this way, but weapons, armor, those are all level ups just the same way that character levels are. The silver sword replaces the iron sword the same way that level 23 replaces level 22. It's permanent because once you get the silver sword, you're not going to get rid of it until, unless you're playing really badly, you're not going to get rid of it until you get the gold sword, and then you're not going to get rid of that until you get the platinum sword. It's just the same as gaining levels in the character sheet. it's just another permanent periodic increase in power. It's just on a different currency. Instead of being on the currency of EXP, it's on the currency of gold pieces or whatever money is usable in the universe. And then
real quick, so it feels like that's sort of a shorthand to establish the hierarchical ranking of elements within a game, right? To say that this one is better than this one because it's just a higher level, right?
Well, it increases the character stat portion of the simulated skill combination. Sometimes it does it by increasing the character level. Sometimes it increases it by the weapon. But no matter what it is, it's just a boost, a numerical boost in the character stat portion of the simulated skills. So
right.
yes, it is very hierarchical.
It's very hierarchical, but my point is that it's sort of a shorthand, right? Because you could go through and just kind of say, on a spreadsheet, sort of give a spreadsheet presentation to say, here's all these things, and here's all the the individual increases and whatnot, and here's all the things that went up. But the shorthand is you went from level 22 to 23, and when you know the game, you know that, oh, that means that like a whole bunch of things went up, right? And I'm now better.
It's symbolic for a legion of small changes that simulate, increasing proficiency. When someone plays basketball, their acquisition of skills is a very smooth affair. They gain little by little, and they gain it in a fairly linear fashion. But it's the periodicity of levels that is really sort of unnatural, right? All of a sudden, a light switch flips, and boom, you've got level 23. And that's just the only really practical way of simulating this real-world thing, or symbolizing, really. So yeah, it's very much an abstraction upon a real-world idea, but it's the one that's worked for game design in the RPG space.
Yeah, it's a nice, I guess it's a nice emotional pulse, right? To say that, right? It's sort of reaching the top of that particular mountain that you're trying to get to. Because if you don't have that in the game, you end up with kind of this endless trickle of very, very small things. And so this is a way to, I think, put a big benchmark in there as opposed to having a whole bunch of little tiny ones.
Right. The periodicity also feels a lot better, right? It's hard to tell. You can't see. You have no perspective on your small, linear, smooth increases. But when you gain a level and that big flash happens in World of Warcraft, it's very satisfying.
It's very satisfying, yeah.
Something I actually enjoy a lot more than going up in levels, and it's a fairly recent development, is seeing specific skills increase. You're running through an MMO and hacking away with your two-handed sword, and all of a sudden you get a little message, your skill with two-handed weapons has increased to 7.
Right.
And that to me, it's like a micro level. It's a very specific skill that's increased, and I really like that development. That wasn't around until recently.
That's true. It's very granular, right? And I think one of the things we're going to see is that the granularity of RPG stats is a product of the thesis which really drives this whole presentation. Is that in video games take every idea that was already in Dungeons and Dragons and take it to their natural extreme, right? It takes every idea to its purest and most rarefied form, and I think granular level ups, leveling up individual pieces of skills, are just an extension of that same idea. And I'll come back to this actually, since it was a good topic, but I'll come back to it in a little bit.
Hey Patrick, I just want to interject. Omkar had asked a question. Why aren't there level ups for NPCs? What a pity.
There are level ups for NPCs. Actually, that actually totally happens. One of the things we'll see, especially later in the JRPG cycle, and this is something I'll get to when we talk about Disgaea towards the end, is that when the games that feature a lot of grinding, which is sort of a niche idea, become their most rarefied forms, you do see everything level up. You see weapons, characters, spells, shopkeepers, relationships, all of those things level up. And so NPCs do level up, and that is very much a thing. And I think probably the first time that I ever saw that happen was Breath of Fire 2. You can absolutely level up some shopkeepers. You can sort of level up your town, and that includes NPCs. That's more an introduction of new NPCs than it is the leveling of current NPCs. But by the time we get to Disgaea, there are NPCs that do level up, and sort of relationships level up too, which is more or less the same. Like in Diablo, how we have the shopkeepers who you have to train them in their skills by paying them gold, which doesn't make any kind of economic sense, but it works for a game. That's a leveling up of an NPC just the same way that anything else is. But we'll get there. That's definitely something that does appear in history.
Hey, Patrick.
Yeah.
Can we go back 2 slides, and I just want to point something out?
Absolutely.
If you look on the slide on the left there, you see those miniatures, and in a war game, they represent 10 soldiers, or 100 soldiers, or 1,000 soldiers. That's a unit. And that was kind of the leap that Gary Gygax and his gaming group took, and some board games had created a hero unit, where it's a guy, really strong, it's the general leading these troops. And that was kind of the leap that Gary and his coworkers took, was, hey,
you're actually on my next slide.
This is you. This is a guy that you play. And so, that really easily developed, once someone had the insight, easily developed from using miniatures in war games. Go ahead.
Right.
Sorry, I jumped on you.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm bringing up. So I actually didn't know that those were representative of multiple units. My Eurostrat knowledge is very limited.
In war games and in simulated battles, those are usually 10, 100, 50 units.
Right. Yeah. So it's supposed to simulate a historical veracity rather than an abstraction that we have in the RPG form. But he's right when he talks about. Of course, he was working at TSR, but in the early days, the way that levels were used, the first time that levels appeared, because levels are the defining aspect of RPGs, and levels were originally balancing mechanics. So in the fantasy supplement to Chainmail, which was the first big game that Gygax and his friends at the Lake Geneva Tactical Society came up with, the wizard, there's more than one. There's like a wizard, a warrior, basically all of the classes that we normally think of as being core RPG classes. But the balance, the way that those characters were balanced is that you could have a wizard who, let me step back. Armies were built. 2 generals would face off in a strategy game, for instance, Chainmail, and those generals would have the same pool of points, or if they wanted to balance the game for skill, they might have a different pool of points, but we would say that 2 generals have 500 points to spend, and all the units in the game cost different amounts to deploy. So if you wanted to deploy swordsmen, they would cost 5 units, you could deploy 100 of them. Or if you want to deploy artillery, that would cost 35 points, so you could deploy fewer of them. And so you would mix and match expensive but really useful units with lower and cheaper units to make a tactically viable army. Hero characters were just a part of that. So to deploy a wizard, and I'm not using the right amount of point values based on the historical norm, but wizards would cost in this case 40 points or 50 points to deploy, so a very expensive unit. But you could reduce the cost of the wizard's deployment by reducing the power of the wizard's skills. So a wizard was a top level, and then originally levels were minuses. We didn't have wizard plus 2, which is an archmage. We had a wizard minus 1, which was a sorcerer, and a wizard minus 2, which was a warlock. And by reducing their powers, you reduced the point value you had to spend, but you also reduced the utility of the wizard in combat. And so it was just a way of balancing, like if you wanted to deploy 3 wizards instead of 1, you could deploy them at -3, so you'd spend the same amount of points, gain a broader geographic utility while reducing the concentration of power. It was just another way of tactically balancing what was still very much a strategy game. But the idea of the level, the character level, was alive and well. And Gygax and Dave Arneson, who was the one who actually suggested the campaign form, realized that this is where it's going to be the bread and butter of the RPG to come. And so they immediately set about working character levels to do something very different. So this is where I'm actually going to turn it over to Mike Breault here for a second, but because I just want to make one statement is that, and he was there at the time, by 1985, TSR, the company that published Dungeons & Dragons, had come up with, and I've done a lot of research on this, TSR had come up with almost all of the design ideas that exist in RPGs still today. it was like I would say that maybe I'd say this is just a guess based on my research, but I'd say 80% of the design ideas that exist in RPGs existed in Dungeons and Dragons first. They came out of the Dungeon Master's Manual, and so for the past almost 30 years now, design idea there haven't been that many new design ideas. Design ideas have been new, and so what designers have had to do instead is reinterpret the Dungeons and Dragons material to create RPGs because Gygax and the other TSR employees were so incredibly thorough with what they did that they had a greater influence on the RPG than I would think even someone like Bach did on classical music. The influence is staggering. But I want to let Mike talk about a little bit about the early days because he was there and I was not even born.
I started at TSR in 1984, so I can probably be said to be the end point of the creativity at TSR. If it ended in 1985, I was probably the cause.
That's pretty arbitrary, but yeah, it's just a zone of ending.
There was a huge cast of people. When I started at TSR, there were 350 people there, and that got pared down to about 85 after a year or two because TSR almost went bankrupt, again, probably because of me. But, those manuals were really a collaborative effort between a great number of people who, many of whom had left the company before I started, many of whom had been there for years and years. And Gary was the public face for TSR and Dungeons and Dragons, and he was good at it. He was great at conventions. He was great with fans, and he really enjoyed being the public face of TSR and Dungeons and Dragons. But as far as creating the products for TSR, there were many, many people besides Gary involved, and a lot of the artists had huge impacts on like the monster manual. They get a general description of a monster, they create this really cool image, and the person designing that monster would look at it and say, boy, I need to add these different attacks because look, he's got claws and a spike and all this stuff. And so all these ideas that came from TSR were really very much a collaborative effort, but way beyond Gary, even though he was kind of the central figure for it all. And I don't know if you had any specific questions, but that was.
I actually do. I'm interested to know because I don't know how much you heard about this. I mean, this would have been a few years before your time, but I looked at a sheet. I compiled basically a sheet of about 200 game design ideas, which comprise the bulk of RPG mechanics. And almost all of those ideas appear for the first time in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which is an otherwise interminable, unplayable piece of design. I mean, a lot of TSR's work was to, streamline what Gygax allegedly, I don't know who really did it, Gygax had allegedly done in Advanced D&D. And so, it's such a comprehensive list. But if even artists are throwing ideas in the monster manuals and things, I mean that really changes the whole idea of who was responsible for this. But at the same time, it also makes it really incredible because if the TSR employees just sort of all together just created this incredibly cohesive and incredibly robust form for gaming, and they did it really collaboratively without having giant meetings all the time. That's sort of a more impressive than one man doing it because that means that you had an environment that was really sort of involved with everyone and where there was not as much conflict. There was just sort of consonance.
Right.
So I'd like to interject something real quick here just to kind of talk about the genre of game design and the profession of game design. My personal philosophy is that the role of the game designer is sort of the herder of cats, right? And is not to be the generator of all the ideas, but to be the shepherd of the vision of the game. And so to be able to take ideas and concepts from the art, from the engineers, from whoever offers up the idea, and decide how that fits into the game. And I'm trying to speak to our audience of game design enthusiasts here to sort of talk about how does this relate to actually doing this as a job, right? So this is definitely, I think, this history is directly applicable because from the earliest days you see that there is always ideas marching steadily towards the product, right? And the game designer is there, like the conductor, to make everything make sense and to tie it all together. So with the fact that we do have artists, putting stuff in, undoubtedly there's lots of stuff that gets suggested that didn't make it in because of any number of practical reasons, right? But ultimately because it would have been bad for the game, it didn't get in. It didn't get in.
Right. For most of these products, the designer was pretty much the conductor of it. For something like the Monster Manual, artists had lots of impact on that. But other things like the DMG, that pretty much came from Gary with minor contributions from other people as editing was done or testing review was done. So in a lot of these products, the designer really was the most powerful creative force on them with feedback from others. Monster Manual was a little different because you gave an idea to an artist, he created an image, and you kind of modified the design to go with that. So that was kind of a separate sort of beast there. But one impact that I might be jumping on something Patrick's going to mention later, one impact that D&D and AD&D has really had on video games is that so many of these people went on to create video games. I'm a minor example, but over at Bethesda, Bethesda, which does Fallout and Elder Scrolls, Bruce Nesmith is the director of development there, and he was a longtime TSR person. There are people at ArenaNet, there are people at ZeniMax, there are people from TSR. We're like the Illuminati. We're everywhere, and you don't really know we're there. And that's possibly a lot of where this carryover came from. We were trained and loved this stuff, and we brought it with us into video games. And so in addition to that, Canon created, C-A-N-O-N, Canon created by Gygax and coworkers early on that Patrick's identified that I ended the creativity period of TSR for.
Just bad timing.
In addition to that, all these people migrated into video games. And I've been in video games since 1987. 4 of us at TSR actually were the designers for Pool of Radiance, the first AD&D video game. And then we just kind of migrated in. So that's another huge effect that paper games has had on video games.
Yeah, and we're actually going to see a lot of that coming up. But diaspora. Please go ahead.
No, I said sorry. I didn't mean to jump on your.
Oh no, absolutely. I'm glad that you can say yes because everything that I'm saying is research about things that happened when I was just a wee lad and I wasn't there. And this is all abstract research that I've done in books. But it's very comforting to hear that someone who was there says that that there's definitely an effect. So I'm very much glad that someone could testify for the work. So, video games, right? This is what the presentation is really about, although, I feel like I guess IGDA covers everybody, including board game people. Do they have their own union? Chris, you know? We lost Chris.
I don't believe so. I'm actually,
No? Okay.
I'm dabbling in board games too, and I haven't seen any kind of union type of a thing, but there's no reason that board games wouldn't be there. I'll sort of post that out in the various forums I'm part of.
Cool. Yeah, because IGDA, obviously, we were talking about video games, and video games are my passion. I love a good tabletop, but video games are for me. I remember it was Christmas or sometime after Christmas in 1993, I played Secret of Mana for the first time, and I realized that this is what I wanted to do with my life. I think I was 8. But video games had already existed, obviously. 1978 is what I consider, from the last presentation, 1978 is what I consider the traditional beginning of video game design. Obviously, video games existed before that, but video game design started around, as its own unique thing, around 1978. And by 1980, there were already D&D, I don't want to call them knockoffs, but D&D campaigns on the PC and the Mac. Some of the examples of that I pictured here, you have Ultima, Wizardry, Might and Magic, Bard's Tale. All of these things were essentially lifting a simplified version of Dungeons & Dragons and porting it to PC and just creating a campaign, a single-player campaign, because obviously multiplayer was functionally impossible at this point. Online, not so much a thing. Connecting things on a LAN, again, that's sort of just what banks and the Department of Defense were doing at this time. So the first stage of the video game development of the RPG was simply to reiterate D&D in a simplified form. Have the text, have the character sheets, have the parties, have it all be more or less the same. There were small changes, but those small changes didn't really amount to a design trend, although we'll see that the design trends definitely cropped up. One of the first things to happen when RPGs entered the video game space was the addition of action. At this point, almost all video games were action games. We didn't have a lot of turn-based, hex-based stuff yet. That really hadn't come through. But Legend of Zelda is a great example of let's just add action to traditional RPG ideas, and the result is it seems obvious in retrospect. Adding action to RPGs seems very obvious, and yet Miyamoto created this spectacular franchise that's still sort of a powerhouse today. Then we were talking about the Elder Scrolls. That's the first Elder Scrolls game there on the right. That's Arena. Now, Arena was originally supposed to be a medieval-style fighting game. It was just a hack and slash, no RPG, medieval combat simulator. And then the designers decided, well, why don't we just go ahead and add some RPG elements, and then we'll take our homebrew D&D setting, and then of course the result is all these some 20-something years later we have Skyrim. So obviously that was a great idea. I'm very glad that they did that. But adding action to the RPG, that's an example of what I call composite design. Composite design is the idea that you take two genres of extant games and you combine them, and rather than having an A plus B game, A plus B somehow equals C. And that's what you get with the action RPG. It's a very powerful form, but it doesn't really express what I want to get at here, which we're going to see with some of the more traditionalist ideas and how they dealt with the influence of Dungeons & Dragons. Did I sense that somebody wanted to jump in here? Okay, good. All right, so, I'm sorry?
Not me.
Okay, all right. So there's what I consider the more traditional stream of RPG development. People who looked at the tabletop and said, I want to do that. I don't want to do an action RPG necessarily. I want to do something that's very much in line with the Dungeons & Dragons and Dungeons & Dragons derivatives that I played as a kid on the tabletop. I think of like the Schaefer brothers, who definitely wanted to do that. What they had to do, because Dungeons & Dragons was so incredibly artistically complete, because Dungeons & Dragons did almost everything that an RPG can do, they decided, well, we can't really do better than Dungeons & Dragons. We're not going to one-up Dungeons & Dragons, which at the time was still evolving in the tabletop space. So they said, what if we just focus on one aspect of Dungeons & Dragons and just take that aspect to its logical extreme? So the first really good example of this is Rogue. Many of you have played games that are roguelikes. Well, Rogue is the game that roguelikes are like. It's the original dungeon crawling, procedurally generated, no mercy, lots of deaths simulator. Rogue was all about just going into a dungeon, killing things, disarming traps, and finding loot. There was not any real story. NPCs were very scant. There was not a lot of setting or characterization. It was all about dungeoning. So it really just focused on just that one piece of Dungeons & Dragons, because Dungeons & Dragons is obviously much more than that. It's a world simulator. But this is just a dungeon simulator. And so it got rid of everything that was extraneous to that idea. And then this proved to be a really successful idea. Games like NetHack redid this. In the modern day, we have FTL, which is a very, very traditional roguelike game, even to the graphics. But we even have games like Diablo. Now, Diablo does have action elements, but Diablo is still, in its most pure essence, an example of taking the single idea from D&D, just dungeoning, and then taking it to its maximum possible. If Rogue was going to just send players through dozens of floors of dungeon and dozens of enemies and collect dozens of pieces of loot, Diablo was going to send them through thousands of dungeons, thousands of pieces of gear, thousands of bosses. It was going to send you through more bosses and gear and dungeons than you could possibly ever hope to memorize. It was about creating the most massive, most sprawling experience of just a dungeon. I mean, because Diablo really is just about dungeons and stats. It's not about characterization. It's not about, really experiencing the world. It's not about mood or setting or plot or theme. It's just about getting in a dungeon and doing damage. And so, I don't know that it's possible to have something more of a pure experience than Diablo in terms of dungeoning. That is, I think, for me, the quintessence of just getting in a dungeon and just killing stuff. It is the ultimate roguelike example, although it's a little bit less cruel than Rogue was. But that wasn't the only idea that designers hit upon. Some designers decided that they wanted to find a new voice, and this is where JRPGs really come into the equation. So the interesting situation in Japan was that Japanese designers did play RPGs in their youth, but at the same time, they didn't play a lot of tabletop RPG. Tabletop RPGs, it didn't make the transition to Japan very easily for whatever reason, commercial reasons that I can't begin to understand. But because Dungeons and Dragons wasn't as much a force in Japan, reiterations like Ultima, like Wizardry and stuff, those were the games that the JRPG designers based their games off of. And because the PC RPGs were single-player experiences that focused on a campaign, a story, a setting, a world, a plot, all of that, because that's the basis for those single-player PC RPGs that Japanese designers would then build upon, JRPGs reflect that very heavily. So JRPGs tend to have much higher, greater focus on a really compelling setting, having a kingdom that has cities and characters and NPCs, a much greater emphasis on character development, especially when you get to Final Fantasy, but also some of the Dragon Quest titles, Aeus, the Secret of Mana series. I mean, all of the great JRPGs of the 90s have a much greater onus on character development than you would see in something like, I'm trying to think of a game, like even Skyrim is not particularly rich in character development. Some of the NPCs are well acted and nuanced, but your main character is telling their own story, and that's the kind of thing that American RPG designers tend to like to do. Also in Fallout and things like that, the player tells their own story. They have their own ideas and they choose. In a JRPG, you don't choose as much as you act. You find a part and you play it. And so you get to play in these very rich worlds and very rich settings that have long for a video game, have long extensive plots, scripts. I mean, the script of Xenogears, even a reduced transcription of Xenogears, runs at about 160,000 words, which is longer than most novels that have won the Pulitzer Prize. Just to give you any, the full running time of I did a word count of it recently for the next upcoming book of Final Fantasy VII, but The Great Gatsby has about 44,000 words, and Xenogears has 160,000. Obviously, they're trying to tell a very long story, and that's what JRPGs are about. And so JRPGs had to do the same thing that roguelikes had to do. They had to focus on one idea, which was just sort of a few ideas, focusing on story and character and setting, and then pare down on everything else. And so, especially in Final Fantasy, what this meant was that other ideas from the Dungeons & Dragons form had to go. And one of the ideas that really went was character classes. And this is the clearest example of it, but there are many other examples that I probably don't have time to get into here. But in Final Fantasy IV, which is considered the sort of revolutionary chapter in the Final Fantasy franchise, there are assigned character classes. They have strengths and weaknesses, and you're stuck with the party that you get. And so you really have to balance your party and your combat choices based on the simulated skills that are possessed by each of your characters and their character classes, which are all mostly inherited from Dungeons & Dragons, like warriors, paladins, wizards, priests, those ninjas. Those are all things that are more or less taken straight out of the Dungeons & Dragons heritage. But by Final Fantasy V, the difficulty of telling a story with a bunch of characters and using character classes for each one of them had become a little too great. And so what they did in Final Fantasy V was they allowed you to mix and match character classes and their skills so that you could you could have a party of 4 people who are going to be the party for the entire game because they're trying to tell a story of 4 people, or actually 5 people, but by mixing and matching character class skills, that party that you have can be tactically viable in any battle. Because it can be technically valid in any battle because you have whatever skills you need, but the plot doesn't have to change to accommodate the character class selections. By Final Fantasy VI, which featured 14 characters, character classes were almost gone. The 400 characters I have on screen there do have job classes, especially in the Japanese version. They're actually explicitly stated. Sabin is a monk. Edgar is an engineer, Cyan is a samurai, and Locke is a thief. But the problem, or maybe not a problem, the difference is that all of those characters can wear equivalent heavy armor. All of them can do physical damage, and all of them are very proficient at magic. The differences between the professed character classes are very few. And the reason for this is that if there are 14 characters in Final Fantasy VI, but you can only use 4 of them because of a tactical balance, the whole point of the game is ruined. Why would you give 14 characters to players and have them have all these different characterizations and all different plot points relating to them if you can only use the warrior, the priest, the archer, and the thief? I mean that would be the game's mechanics defeating its essential goal, which is to tell a story in a persuasive world. And so in Final Fantasy VI, first of all, everyone can use magic, which is the big equalizer. But also, everyone is more or less equally armored and equally equipped with weapons. The damage and abilities of every player are essentially the same. And that allows players to use whichever characters they like or whichever characters they like on a personality basis. They can use which characters they think are cool. And this is such a difference from even as far back as Final Fantasy IV, but a huge difference from as far back as things like Ultima, where you really had to have a balanced party mechanically, or you were going to get thrashed by the monsters. Whereas in Final Fantasy VI, you don't. You can have whichever party you just think is the most interesting. And that's just a huge, huge sea change. But the reason for this is, again, just the trend of paring down from all the ideas of Dungeons & Dragons and just focusing on one thing. In this case, they're focusing on the story and character and plot aspects and setting aspects that had come from Dungeons & Dragons, but were by this point stripped away in favor of just a few things. Now, there was a reaction to this. I mean, Final Fantasy VII represented the first time that the public really got, especially the Western public, got a look at the JRPG. And JRPGs came into much greater prominence after this, especially, you can see it on the screen, Pokemon, probably the most successful RPG of any kind of all time, in terms of sales figures and dollars and people still playing. But Pokemon and Disgaea, which is also pictured, are examples of secondary extremes. Final Fantasy took character classes, and Diablo took roguelikes, or Final Fantasy rather took plot and story and character, and Diablo took the roguelike mechanics to their natural conclusions. You couldn't go any further. Those games are as much like themselves as they can be without having to do something entirely new. Pokemon is just a really good example of a reaction against that. Pokemon is all about character classes. If you think about it, all of those 600 Pokemon are just character classes. Now, there's a lot of overlap between, say, Chimchar and Charizard, but at the same time, they're different, and they do different things, and they're appropriate for different situations. So what we're really talking about here is a 600 character class game where it's all about party composition. The entire game is about leveling up and party composition. So it's almost the opposite of Final Fantasy, where the entire game was about plot and story and enjoyment and personality and theme. Pokemon eschews all of those things and simply goes for only party composition, only character class, nuances, and just having the right party that will be able to defeat the optimal party that can defeat anything that exists out there. Especially if you've ever been to a Pokemon tournament, the party composition tactics for a Pokemon tournament are incredibly arcane. You can go on really good Pokemon forums and see just like massive lists of dependency charts and contingencies for how to construct a party that will do really well in a tournament, because you have to have this really precise blend of everything, which is just sort of the complete opposite of what Final Fantasy is doing, but it's still the same idea. Take one idea from, or one or two or three ideas from Dungeons & Dragons, cut everything else away, and then you have your own different game. And that resulted in Pokemon, which is 600 character classes and is just this massive phenomenon that has its own cartoons and a trading card game and everything else. So it's really interesting to me, at least, that if you cut away much of Dungeons & Dragons and just emphasize what remains, people will, it'll reach a whole new audience. Like you can't, I don't think there's probably a lot of overlap between the Pokemon audience, which is very young, and the Dungeons & Dragons audience, which tends to be much older relative to people who play those sorts of games. And so I think that's just one of the fascinating ideas from the history of RPGs. I'll try to be brief about this guy. This guy is a really good example of the same trend. It's, again, another Japanese RPG. But one of the things that we saw in Final Fantasy that I didn't really mention was that in order to keep the game interesting, it had to be still difficult, right? One of the key things in an RPG for telling stories is difficulty. If there's a boss battle that's really hard, anything that comes off of after that boss battle is going to feel more meaningful. So even if you have a kind of a mediocre plot, if you pace it well in terms of encounters, dungeons, fights, and all that, it seems more interesting than it really was, and it's because of the game design elements that are reinforcing the story. So what Final Fantasy did to get rid of, it had to get rid of all of its tactical aspects, and so what it supplemented instead was grinding. Grinding is having to level up multiple times in sequence and having to do lots of dedicated leveling in between normal encounters. You can't simply progress through the story straight away. You have to stop and then sort of refurbish yourself every now and again with killing monsters or doing quests or accumulating money. Disgaea takes that one idea, so this is what I call a secondary extreme. Disgaea takes an extreme idea, an idea was already extreme from Final Fantasy, and then takes it even further. In Disgaea, and this is getting back to what we said about NPCs leveling up. In Disgaea, your NPCs do level up. Your shopkeepers level up. Your relationships level up. Your characters level up. Your weapon proficiencies level up. Your spells level up. The things that you have access to level up. You can even level up your level ups by using the reincarnation ability. It's just this sort of extreme, almost absurd play on what was already extreme in Final Fantasy. It's just that if you started with Final Fantasy as your frame of reference, Disgaea only seems like it's extreme in one sense. It takes one idea from Final Fantasy and runs with it. But if you look all the way back to Dungeons & Dragons, you can see just the incredible extremity to which Disgaea and even Pokemon are going. They're taking ideas that were already extreme in JRPGs and inflecting them again so that they almost seem like they have no connection to Dungeons & Dragons, even though they clearly do. But if you were playing Pokemon or Disgaea and you had no frame of reference about Dungeons & Dragons, you might not even think that those things were ever connected. But they are. And so actually, coming to the end of the presentation here, but one of the things I wanted to say about the RPG genre is that even though I have this theory, which some of you may not agree with, but even if it's right and Dungeons & Dragons is sort of the mother of all RPGs and all of the ideas that existed in Dungeons & Dragons are just simply reiterated in all of the games that we love to play today, it hasn't hurt the RPG genre. In fact, the RPG genre is doing better than ever. So just because designers these days have to go to extremes, literal extremes, or have to simply play with the recombinant DNA of Dungeons & Dragons, it doesn't mean that the RPG genre is ever going to suffer. I mean, designers seem to be able to do it very well. World of Warcraft is a good example of sort of freshly generated extreme. Dungeons & Dragons is necessarily a turn-based game. People have to take turns in order to make the simulated action work. But once you get into the action format, you can have as many people playing at the same time as you can technically support. And World of Warcraft is a really good example of that, because in World of Warcraft you can have 25 players playing the same raid. This would be impossible at your dining room table playing Dungeons & Dragons. I mean, just the pizza bill alone would be insane. But the turns that it would take, you would never be able to finish the game. I mean, you could get through like 1 or 2 rounds in an entire night, and then everyone would have to go back home. But in World of Warcraft, because it's in an action context, everybody plays simultaneously. And otherwise, I think World of Warcraft is actually, and I don't mean this as an insult at all, World of Warcraft is highly derivative of Dungeons & Dragons. But because it changes the context, it seems fresh and new. The same thing is true for Bravely Default, which is here on the right. Bravely Default, it has a very playful attitude towards Dungeons & Dragons. In the upcoming Bravely Default game, one of the character classes that's going to be available is called the Pastry Chef. And I won't go into exactly what that means tactically because it's kind of just funny. But the idea that Bravely Default is working with is that what if we just treated the material of Dungeons & Dragons, or wherever they think they're getting their material, ironically, and just you had really strange and really playful mechanics? Would that make the RPG genre fresh? And the critical response to Bravely Default and the popular response was very good. So obviously, it's still possible to create an RPG that's wholly yours, even though you're simply using the material that Gygax and TSR created more than almost 30 years ago. And so, yeah, I've said a lot there, especially I went on a real tear there, I understand. I also speak very fast, so if anyone wants anything reiterated, please let me know. But that's just a general outline of how we went from Dungeons & Dragons seemingly totally complete as an art form all the way to the present, and with a series of changes that are really just reiterations, but they're fascinating reiterations. And I think that it gives us a way of seeing how reiteration is not a bad thing. I mean, a lot of critics talk about how we have another boring brown military shooter, more chest-high walls. But reiteration done well can be very good, and I think the RPG genre shows us exactly how that's true.
Thanks. That was really thought-provoking and informative, and I know that we've got people ready to go, and I've got some questions. So I'm gonna try an experiment here. Amkar has been dying to see if he can't use his phone mic to ask his question verbally. So we're going to give this a try and see how it goes. So Amkar, I hope you're ready to go. I'm going to unmute you now, and keep it brief.
My citations real quick.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, put that stuff up there.
Please go ahead, Amkar.
We hear you, Amkar.
You sort of coming in and out.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So I would like to ask why RPGs feature only monsters and fantasy and not urban environments. I mean,
that's a good question.
Gamers do like that, but why are there no urban environments?
So actually, that's a good question, and I think we can actually get to two ideas. The first idea is that there are urban RPGs, and there are a lot of RPGs, especially in the Japanese space. We don't get a lot of them in the West or published on Steam or something like that. But there are a lot of RPGs that are totally not fantasy settings. So Inazuma 11 is a really good example of this. Inazuma 11 is a soccer RPG. I think it's a high school soccer team, and you level up and you grind and you do all of the typical RPG mechanical stuff, but it takes place in a high school, a story about a high school soccer team who they're just slowly getting better at soccer. And I think that's a really wonderful example of a non-traditional plot for an RPG. But also, if you look at things like Shadowrun and Deus Ex, those are all RPGs that take place in urban contexts. But I will say that your impression of the RPG as being a very fantasy-oriented thing is true. I think that Dungeons & Dragons, if you want to be very cynical about it, Dungeons & Dragons is simply the intersection of Euro strategy, what we call Euro strategy, which were back then called war games. Dungeons & Dragons is the intersection of war games and the work of Tolkien, right? Because all of the fantasies of Dungeons & Dragons were very Tolkien-esque. And so those two ingredients resulted in Dungeons & Dragons, and I think a lot of the inheritance that has been seen in games like Final Fantasy or Ultima or or the Elder Scrolls shows its influence. That if designers wanted to do, I mean, this is what designers do, right? Designers think of new mechanics. So if designers wanted to do things mechanically that were new, they may not have had the time or the wherewithal to do things that were new from a plot perspective. But we do have games like Mass Effect. Mass Effect is very much a science fiction setting, and Mass Effect was a hugely popular game. The Deus Ex series too, very much a science fiction setting, also an action context. But again, it is an urban and science fiction oriented fantasy, in as much as that's different from the Tolkien-esque fantasies we see. But I agree with you if you get the impression that most RPGs are Tolkien-esque fantasies. That's true. They mostly are. I think that just shows where they came from, the Dungeons and Dragons mold, and that what has changed has not been the lore.
I'd like to add something to that, if I could. TSR's experience, TSR did a whole bunch of role-playing games aside from D&D and AD&D. We had Gangbusters, which was 1930s, Chicago-era kind of gang people. There was a Wild West game. There was Star Frontiers, a sci-fi game. And none of them were anywhere near as successful as D&D and AD&D, even with cross-marketing, promoting them in all our D&D and AD&D products. They just didn't do well. And I think the real appeal of fantasy is it's a simpler time. There aren't all these complications. It's not technology-based like science fiction, and even modern-day urban games would be technology-based. It's very, very personal to you. All the power comes from you, and I think that's a really attractive thing for players. And TSR tried its heart out to create other genres of role-playing games, and they all pretty much didn't do very well. There was Top Secret, which is a spy game set in modern-day urban settings, and it just didn't do that well. People don't flock to it the way they do the fantasy setting, and I think it's very much psychology, immersion, and who you want to be, who you want to pretend to be.
So yeah, real quick, I just want to say we're getting real close to the top of the hour, and it's very clear that we have plenty to chew on to go past the top of the hour. So I'm just going to say we're going to go past the top of the hour. If everybody else has no pressing, this is what we did last time, and let's just do it again. Can you two stay? And
I've got it at least until 1:30, so yeah.
Okay, great. So let's shoot for at least an extra 15 minutes to be able to do Q&A and stuff. And now I'm going to jump in with kind of my question comment, which ties in a lot to what we were just talking about, which is that, like, why orcs and elves, right, and dwarves? Why does it feel to do that? Number one, my own personal sense of this, having been a designer and try to do other things also, is that there is a huge amount of inertia, right? Like the fact that D&D came along, and that whenever anybody starts a new genre in any medium, they create these templates for how things are going to go, right? Like the TV talk show has a host behind a desk because the guy who invented that format just did that. So that has become kind of the standard, right? And D&D set the template for all this stuff, which is like what's kind of the underlying point of this whole presentation, is that like it brought all these things. And so that context, that universe, that fantasy universe has come along with it, along with the notion that, you know, clerics can only use maces. They don't use edged weapons, which, interesting historical tidbit, is based off of Bishop Odo, who was the brother to William the Conqueror, who swore that as a holy man he would not shed blood, so he would use like this big morning star with like spikes and stuff on it because he was a holy man and wouldn't shed blood, and that formed the basis for why clerics don't get to use like you can only use maces in D&D. Like there's just a bunch of funny stuff like that goes in there. That's just a fun anecdote. But so here's my carefully worded comment that I wanted to throw in here. I feel RPGs allow a player to explicitly create their own story from the gameplay, right? Now, you mentioned in the JRPGs, there's sort of a pre-authored storyline that the player follows through, but the thing about an RPG is it allows the player to customize their avatar and other elements of the game so that even though you're following a pre-authored storyline, you're still creating your own unique gameplay experience that you can relate to other people afterwards about how it resonated with you, right? And so to the point where players often have a hard time seeing the difference between saying I did this in the game or my character did this in the game, right? Like those things are often go back and forth. Certainly I do it when I talk about my awesome game sessions. So I think that's something that the whole RPG thing really does better than other games, is that ability to literally write your own heroic saga, and possibly the fantasy setting is just ideal for a heroic saga.
Well, there are very few rules, right? Anything can happen in a fantasy. If you think of like a soccer RPG, not anything can happen. I mean, it depends how.
Well, it could be. You could have a superhero run, right? I mean, like that's the other, like comic book is the other universe genre that allows all kinds of crazy things. And it's interesting that there haven't been as many. I mean, there's been stabs at superhero RPGs, but they just haven't done as well as the fantasy thing for some reason. I'm not sure why.
That is weird. Yeah, I probably has something to do with people's like how easy is it to get a person to suspend their disbelief in any given setting, and that fantasy is simply the easiest setting because I think the suspension of disbelief takes a while to establish, or at least, or it can be very difficult to preserve. And if you're trying to do all these mechanical things at the same time, the fantasy setting just makes it easiest to do those mechanical things. You can economize on effort by using a fantasy setting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so Rob Stamper had asked a question earlier, and it was kind of another big question, and so I wanted to save it to the end here, and I'm looking back in the queue of questions where it is. Oh, there we go. Okay, so he asks, what opinion do you have on negative leveling, which is a decision for the RPG to actually take you backwards, right, to lower your, to lose your levels?
Well, I think that if you have any trend, right, that the trend in levels is to be a permanent periodic increase in power. So anytime you have a trend, someone is going to deconstruct that trend and do the opposite or do something very subversive to it. And I think that's good. Because if everyone was bound to do the same thing all the time, we would never get any innovations. So the idea of negative leveling is, for me, a good idea in limited supply, because I don't think that if negative leveling crept into everything, it would mostly take the form of penalization. If you think of like games that are like free-to-play games, especially from 2008 to about 2012, how many free-to-play games there were, and how much they punished you in the level-up curves. Imagine if they had also taken to the extreme where you lost levels. How incredibly infuriating that would have been. And they could have done it, except that they were bound by audience expectation to have those levels be permanent levels. So like genre inclinations made everyone expect levels to be permanent, and so they were. And I think that if they had said, okay, we're going to do negative levels because you haven't played in 2 months, that people would have they realized that people would have gotten so upset because that broke with tradition so hard that they would have lost their audience and then lost their money supply. So while I think that negative levels are a good idea sparingly, it's like adding hot peppers to something. It's a good idea to do it a little bit, but I wouldn't do it for everything.
I remember when I was playing EverQuest, and you would just get punished hard for dying, right? And that's just, I think there's just been an evolution of in game design to make things less punishing, generally speaking, right? Like there's certain spikes that go against that. Like the current game whose name is escaping me right now, but I'm sure everybody knows what it is. You're like a dead guy. Dark Souls, absolutely. So Dark Souls is a standout because it has just said, we're not going to go with that trend. We're going to go all the way back to make it really, really hard. But they're choosing to go after kind of a smaller portion. I think what you see now is like a lot of decisions in the more like games that have gone to the mass market to make failure less punishing, which opens up kind of the freedom of the player to experiment a lot more and do things differently, right? Like just try to see what happens when you jump off that cliff, or just do something silly in the game because you don't have a half-hour run back to your dead body, or you're going to lose a level or something like that. So from a game design point of view, there's trade-offs to be made with all these things, and the negative leveling is not automatically a bad thing, but it certainly has a tremendous potential negative cost to the player experience that a designer needs to carefully consider that to see if that's appropriate in the current marketplace for games, right? Like that was okay a long time ago, and there's a reason why things have evolved away from that now. Oh, Mike, you're muted.
If you're willing to go, oh, I think I just unmuted myself. Okay. Yeah. If you're willing to go for a niche market, you're willing to forego the mass market, you can do things like that. And personally, I like that. Negative leveling, you make a bad decision, you lose stuff. You make a bad decision, your arm gets cut off, and it's reflected with, you're worse at attacking. You've gone down a couple levels. That, to me, would be refreshing. And I think it makes player choice more meaningful. If you can save at any point and make any dumb decision you want and just load your last game, and there's no effect, that makes your decisions less meaningful, in my opinion. And personally, I think there's a real call, a real interest in games that where decisions have actual consequences and they're kind of permanent. I like that.
There was Shay Rossi points out a really interesting thing that has come out with Shadows of Mordor, right? The new game. When you die, you don't lose ground on your character, but the NPC who beat you gets kind of the experience points for the win, and they become more powerful. So that's a really great kind of flipping of that thought process, and it's a new interesting direction, and I predict that's something that is just going to become used by like everybody after now is going to want to put that in their games because it's just so cool, right? It's like
first place I saw that mechanic existed in the original Guild Wars. I don't know if it existed before that. It may have, but the original Guild Wars, there was a sort of in the newbie zone, which was called Pre-Seer, Pre-Seer Ascalon. There was one enemy who was a hero unit that you could go out and face, and if you let him kill you enough times, he would level up, and then you could then kill him and gain the experience that he had gained back, and it was a way of like sort of doing a Ponzi scheme of levels so that you could hit the level cap while still in the newbie area. And that was a really famous thing at the time, at least among Guild Wars players. But that was a thing that definitely existed back in the day. But Shadows of Mordor has taken it and really sort of valorized it in a really meaningful way. And I do think that will be something that's going to be important, especially I think in MMOs that'll be implemented eventually.
Yeah, I don't know if either of you guys played MOBAs, like League of Legends or Dota 2 or multiplayer online battle arenas, but that's a standard game mechanic there. You actually talk about feeding the opposing team. They kill you, they get gold, they get experience, and they're leveling up at your expense. And you're losing gold, you're not losing any experience, but you've got a timeout there. And that's a standard part of that gameplay.
I think that that notion that's happening, right, is very natural in a multiplayer, head-to-head mode. But I think the genius is then applying that to an NPC, right? Because a big goal in game design is to make the NPCs feel more alive and more believable, right? And so we've created faction rating, relationship ratings with NPCs and those kinds of things. And this is another axis of growth for them that's driven by the player, right? It's another way for the player to impact and change the world. So they're changing themselves, and then they're changing the world too. And that's something that, Patrick, that you were talking about earlier with the JRPGs, that there's the evolution of that is to make the world really, really reactive in as many ways as possible to what the player is doing, right? So the shopkeepers are leveling up and doing all these things. And there's a possibility that the player can lose track of all the minutia, right? I mean, the real world is super complicated, but luckily most of it doesn't really affect us that much, right? But a game world, classically, in a game, the game will tell you, will bring to your attention things that are important to your gameplay, and that's like you always know that in any kind of text or even in a tabletop game, if the GM says, "Oh, there's a room and there's a hook or a lever on the wall," you see, it's like, okay, so maybe there were like 30 or 40 notable things about that room, but the GM told you there's a lever on the wall, right? It's like, okay, so I need to go focus on that. And if you're a troll GM, you can really mess with your players' heads by pointing out stuff that has absolutely no relevance whatsoever. But there's an unspoken trust between the game master and the player, and this is true also for game designers. There's a trust there that the player has that the designer is not going to, play head games outside the scope of whatever the game rules are, right? Like we agree that we're going to show you stuff, and it will make sense, right? Like fake doors and things are always like the no-no breaking of that that trust rule. So I don't even know where I was going with this, but it made sense when I started. Go ahead.
So we got another question, or?
Yeah. Shay says, the balance is the player should always feel like winning is possible, right? And yes. That's yes.
That's the number one most essential thing in a game. If you don't have that, you have a bad game.
Right. And in fact, I was playing a game. So something I was playing this game on Steam called Endless Legend last night. It was my first time in to play it, and they have to talk about kind of another, almost like a civilization RPG, right? Is Sid Meier's Civilization, and Endless Legend is that kind of a game. And I found myself in the session last night where there was another, the NPC was getting increasingly hostile to me, and I was able to take a look at what they had in terms of resources and stuff, and I just felt like, okay, there's nothing at this point of the game that I feel like I can do that's going to get me out of this. Kind of once they get bigger than you, you're kind of screwed. Like there wasn't room enough to be cleverness because they're just sort of rising on all metrics. There wasn't any wiggle room there, and I think that's something that game designers really need to think about, right? Is how do you have that sense? And that's in terms of the hero saga. You want to have that place where you're really down, right? Classically, in the way Joseph Campbell writes out sort of the hero's journey is you have you get that call and you succeed a little bit and you think, oh yeah, I could do this adventure, and then you get slapped down really, really hard, right? Like there's always that point in the movie where the hero has just been, he got cocky or whatever, and he gets beaten up by all the bad guys to as close to death as you can possibly get, and then you get that, the training montage that then sort of brings you back up to the point because it makes that win even more epic, right? So even in the depth point of that journey for the player, they always still need to have, even if it's just a trust in the game designer, that the designer is going to give me something. Like the designer wouldn't do this to me. The designer wouldn't put me in a death spiral, right, that I cannot possibly get out of, right? That's our job as designers. That's why people have to pay us money to do this, because it doesn't just automatically do itself. There is things like death spirals, and you can have games that put you into a place that you cannot recover from. And as designers, we need to set up the rules in a way that makes sure that players always do have the the opportunity to snatch success from from the depths of hell.
I agree with that, almost word for word. So.
Okay, so I have another question.
Yeah.
There was something that came up during the presentation that I was thinking about, and what do you think of the idea that did the dungeons of D&D, right, with the maps and the monsters and everything all kind of laid out there, how much do we have a direct link to like the early video games like Mario, where they have these game levels, right? Because I was around actually to play Pong when it first came out, and you didn't have levels in Pong, right? So,
right. Well, that's a good question. I can give you an example where I definitely know that RPG levels, Dungeons and Dragons levels, mattered in a very real sense, and that's in the first-person shooter. We talked about this a little bit in the last webinar that we did, but the first-person shooter took its level design from RPG dungeons. They are RPG dungeons. They act like RPG dungeons. They operate like RPG dungeons. Everything is the same except you can't level up. Although you sort of can, because you can gain little power-ups along the way.
Yep.
They're not permanent, but if you think of like Wolfenstein or Doom, those are absolutely RPG dungeons with all of the switches and the great little treasure rooms and the secrets and the hidden monster alcoves and the health rejuvenation points,
right,
and checkpoint. Like everything is just completely lifted straight out of the RPG and adventure. And now that was, of course, after Ultima had already had like 5 editions, and Wizardry had 6 editions, and so they were borrowing 3D dungeons from other people who use 3D dungeons. But we all know that those Ultima dungeons were straight out of Dungeons & Dragons, so
Yeah.
that's a very clear example where, yes, those levels were absolutely lifted from the D&D template. I think that Mario levels do something very different, and I would actually love to give a presentation on that, but Mario levels have their own sort of, what I call the CCST structure, challenge, cadence, and skill theme. They developed to a place where they're similar. I think, if you're designing a game, you're going to have two different kinds of game are going to have similarities naturally because of the necessities of a game. So I think that Mario levels and RPG levels grew towards each other, but I don't think that they had a common genesis.
Okay. Historically speaking.
Right. I think that Miyamoto was coming from someplace very different when he was doing what he was doing, and in order to, I've done a ton of research on that. I wrote a whole book on it, but in order to get into that, we're not going to be able to pull that off here. Not succinctly.
Okay, that's cool. Well, I would love to see it's sort of as a post-presentation conversation. I would love to get your thoughts on identifying the different kinds of subgenres, just in kind of a chart.
Yeah.
Of like, here's RPGs and here's kind of the different flavors to sort of show that evolution in a visual form. Maybe I can talk with you after.
That would be interesting. I mean, again, we could make it comprehensive. I don't know, but it would certainly be an interesting thing to do.
Well, I think that, it's the kind of thing I'd love to have, I think, for game designers, right, to sort of look at that and just think, because that really, it's a pondering device to look at that chart and think of like, all right, what am I doing in my game? What are the decisions that go into making these things not the same game, right? Like
or to be more, in my opinion, to be more honest, what part of D&D am I going to break off and work into a shapeable form?
Yep, all of that.
It would be very interesting.
Let's see, is there anything else here? It looks like we've either put everyone to sleep or they are all set to go. So why don't you go ahead and hand me back the presentation baton. And I'm going to put up that last slide, which kind of is here we go, show my screen, and I'm going to go here. So thank you, everybody who stuck through us for the whole, hour and a quarter. I found this to be a fascinating one, and, we strive to make it interesting and informative every month. So thanks very much to Patrick. Always a great session. Thanks to Mike.
Thank you, guys.
You were there, and I love having, I think we all really love to hear it like directly from somebody who was there. Next month we have going in a completely different direction. We have monetizing for game monetization from day one with Ethan Levy. That looks like fun, and of course every week on Wednesday there's a different webinar for different parts of the whole game development universe. And if you have ideas or questions, or you just want to, pledge your undying love to any of us, send it to webinars@igda.org, and we'll get it and post it on the wall and stay happy. And Shay, go ahead and keep working on the beard. It'll come. Just play a dwarf. That really seems to be, I think, the shortcut to getting lots and lots of facial hair. And Amkar says, when do I get the presentation? This is being recorded. It'll go on YouTube sometime within like a few days to a week from now. It'll be posted on the IGDA channel and YouTube. And with that, I'm going to stop the session and say thanks, and everybody have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye now.